you'd understand why we weren't exactly prepared for what came next. Dr. Greaves had been droning on for hours, his voice barely registering through the icy hum of the plane. My focus was elsewhere, on the windswept Arctic plain far below. The turbulence this low was unforgiving, rattling my teeth and jarring every bone in my body. The plane's interior was no better, a frigid metal tomb that barely kept the howling cold at bay. But the view, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. An endless white expanse, broken only by jagged monoliths of black volcanic rock. It looked less like Earth and more like the desolate surface of some hostile alien world. Dr. Greaves hadn't stopped smiling, even as his breath misted and his lips turned a faint shade of blue. Most of the team down there are geologists and meteorologists, he said, his excitement cutting through the monotony. Until a week ago, they had no reason to consider an archaeologist. After all, the ice sheet is miles thick and anchored to bedrock. Their primary concern was the usual global warming, melting patterns, that sort of thing. He paused, his grin widening as he leaned closer, his words a faint cloud in the freezing air. Then we found it. What did you think it was at first? I asked, my voice barely audible over the plane's engines. Well, sonar showed it was hollow in places, with parts clearly made of wood and metal. But the size, it was unlike anything we'd ever seen. Honestly, Dr. Rosette, we didn't know. We don't guess. It biases the science, but nothing could have prepared us for the truth. The air samples trapped in the surrounding ice, they're over 85,000 years old. He leaned back with a self-satisfied sigh. A ship like this rewrites history. The word ship lingered in my mind like an unwelcome shadow. I glanced at him. Quite a discovery. Quite the luck, too, he replied. The ice sheet is degrading faster every year. Warmer temperatures create more liquid water, eroding caves and expanding existing ones. That's how we found it. A newly opened cave system revealed it. A matter of days between discovery and loss, if you think about it. So it's a miracle, I said, more to myself than him. Exactly, that's what I've been saying. It's not just a once-in-a-lifetime event, Dr. Rosette. It's once in an epoch. I couldn't help but laugh, a short, sharp sound that felt misplaced amidst the mounting tension. Dr. Greaves flinched, his pride bruised. I believe you, I said quickly. It's just luck like this tends to raise questions. Greaves slumped into his seat, his enthusiasm deflating. They think it's a hoax, he muttered, bitterness seeping into his tone. Even after we brought in 3 independent teams to confirm it, they still call me a fraud. Proof is in the pudding, I said, offering a half-smile. You know the truth, and soon, so will everyone else. The doctor perked up slightly, but before he could respond, the intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice announced our descent. I turned back to the window as we sank into the pale mist below. My breath caught as the camp came into view. Tiny figures scurrying between tents and equipment in a frenzy of activity. The base was a hive of exhaustion and purpose, every movement underpinned by an unspoken urgency. 2 men argued over a dismantled ice drill, their voices rising over the din nearby. A trio wrestled with restless sled dogs. In the center of the chaos stood a small table, where 2 older men hunched over scattered tools and instruments. Dr. Greaves' voice broke my focus. Dr. Rosette, he called out, waving to the men at the table. The older of the 2 turned, his face ruddy and round, a grotesque parody of Santa Claus. Ah, Dr. Rosette, he boomed, his cheer grating against the camp's bleak atmosphere. He introduced himself as Dr. Whittle, gesturing to his wiry, weathered companion, Dr. Shirley. They were caricatures of explorers, right down to the frost-encrusted ropes and spiked boots slung over their shoulders. Your tent's over there, Whittle said, gesturing vaguely toward the far corner of the camp. His smile was toothy, too wide, too eager. I barely acknowledged him. My attention was locked on the tools they carried, wicked, jagged implements that seemed better suited for violence than excavation. There was something wrong here. something the endless ice had buried, not just for millennia, but for a reason. And now, we were digging it back up. "I'd like to see it," I said, masking my unease with a smile. "I'll gear up now and join you." Dr. Whittle shifted on his feet, a shadow of hesitation crossing his face. "Oh, well, we sort of hoped you'd." "No need to worry about my schedule, gentlemen." I cut him off, still smiling. "That's my job. I'll be with you shortly." I didn't wait for a reply. Picking up my gear, I marched toward my tent, noting the small, laughable cotton heater inside. Clearly, they hadn't expected much of me, but unlike Whittle's assumptions, I wasn't some novice. I'd spent years working in the Arctic Circle. I knew the cold, I knew isolation, and I knew how to handle both better than most. By the time I'd unpacked, layered up, and secured my gear, no more than 30 minutes had passed. Stepping back outside, I expected to see the doctors waiting for me, but the camp was eerily quiet. The 3 men were gone. I flagged down a young woman passing by, asking if she'd seen where they went. Her answer made my blood simmer. They'd started their descent shortly after I'd entered my tent. My jaw tightened. "Show me the entrance," I muttered, my patience thin. She led me to the fissure. Fresh rigging was embedded in the ice, and a slack rope dangled ominously into the abyss. "Thank you," I said, though my voice lacked gratitude. I clipped my safety line to the rigging, ignoring her protests. "Wait, you can't," she started. But I was already lowering myself into the crevasse, her voice swallowed by the icy wind. I couldn't say what drove me, only that I'd been dragged into this venture at the last possible minute, and the blatant disregard for my presence had stoked something primal in me. It didn't help that I knew why I'd been invited in the first place, not to bolster the project's credibility, but to bury it. It wasn't my first time being the scapegoat. Over the years, my name had been stapled to enough risky papers to ensure they sank into obscurity. My presence here was no different. To them, I was a walking career death sentence. The descent wasn't long, but it was enough to unsettle me. The fissure led to a sprawling cave system carved into the heart of the glacier. When I landed, the ground wasn't bedrock, but sheer ice, slick and treacherous. Beneath me, I could feel the vast emptiness, miles of ice separating me from the earth below. The sensation of floating over nothingness was nauseating. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the breach above, and the constant roar of surface winds was muted to a distant whisper. My headlamp lit up the walls around me, turning them into a kaleidoscope of blue and white, a dazzling, crystalline prison. It was breathtaking, and yet it felt wrong. The further I ventured, the more the cave opened up. The vast, cathedral-like spaces amplified my every step, every breath, every thought. I clipped into the marked safety lines and pressed forward, my boots slipping more than once. At one point, I lost my footing entirely and slid dangerously close to the edge of a black chasm. My safety line jerked me back, but the realization of how easily I could have vanished into that abyss left my hands trembling. Still, I pushed on. By the time I reached the others, my lungs burned and my body ached. The 3 men stood ahead, their faces half lit by their lamps. Whittle's gaze flicked to me, and though I couldn't hear him, I saw his lips twist into a sneer. I didn't care. All thoughts of confrontation evaporated when I saw it. The sight stopped me dead. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. It looked just like the photographs, yet it didn't feel real. No photograph could capture this. No painting, no sketch. Nothing could prepare someone for the sheer, incomprehensible presence of it. The object stood just meters away, entombed in the clear, shimmering ice. At first glance, it resembled a ship, but the longer I stared, the more it defied reason. Its angles were wrong, its design alien. The ice around it glowed faintly, as though the ship itself was radiating a cold, blue light. I felt my knees weaken, and a chill swept through me that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperature. This wasn't just a discovery. This was something that had been waiting. something we were never meant to find. The ice wall began, its crystalline surface veiling the unimaginable. Just a few meters further, the prow of the ship jutted out, black, jagged, and colossal. Frozen in time, it loomed impossibly large for any wooden vessel, a relic of madness encased in ice. It looked alive, somehow, like a monstrous aquatic predator pressing its face against the ice, straining to peer into a world it didn't belong to. Something about it made my skin crawl. The longer I stared, the more I felt the weight of its presence, a primal, nameless fear curling in my gut. "How big is it?" I managed to say, though my voice sounded thin and small. "The air pocket is about 800 meters, came a reply. I wasn't sure who spoke. My eyes were glued to the ship. When I finally turned to the three men, my expression must have betrayed my disbelief. Whittle was the first to respond. The nose is clearly visible. About 100 meters tall, he said, his voice tinged with something between excitement and dread. As for the rest, sonar shows the cavity. It's trapped and spans 800 meters in length. It could be half that, I said, the words tumbling out unsteadily, and it'd still shatter everything we know about shipbuilding. The largest ships today, steel giants, are barely 400 or 500 meters. But this is a city that floats. It shouldn't exist, Dr. Shirley muttered, his voice cold and firm. The way he said it sent a chill through me. There was no awe, no wonder, only grim certainty, as if the ship's existence was a breach of some unspoken law. "It does exist, Garrett," Whittle snapped, his voice rising with frustration. "That issue has been settled. This is the find of a lifetime." Dr. Greaves chimed in, his tone pleading. "Please, gentlemen, this is special. Something beyond." But Shirley wasn't swayed. His expression darkened as their argument unraveled. He never outright stated his case in front of me, but his words skirted dangerously close to heresy in the scientific community. He hinted that they should have buried the discovery, ignored the evidence, and walked away. I left them to their bickering and turned my attention back to the ship. Its jagged, angular silhouette stood stark against the ice, a massive, pitch-black anomaly. It was unlike any ship I'd ever seen. Its construction a grotesque marriage of brutalist simplicity and alien elegance. "This won't see the outside world," I said abruptly, my voice cutting through their argument like a knife. The men turned to me, startled by the finality in my tone. "I'm sorry, Dr. Greaves," I continued, "but you won't be recognized for this discovery or any others. Some truths are too big, and this is one of them. You can't say that." Greaves cried, his face pale. "We've had visitors from a dozen universities. They've seen it right in front of them, and they won't be recognized either," I said, forcing a grim smile. "Some things break the scientific method, and this shatters it. There's no framework for it, no precedent. It's too big, too impossible. We have to try," he said desperately. "The proof is in the pudding." I shook my head. "It won't matter. The more you prove, the worse it'll get. If you haven't noticed, the world doesn't like anomalies. The moment it becomes clear you're telling the truth, that's when they show up." Shirley's shoulders sagged. For the first time, I saw defeat in his eyes. "They're welcome to it," he said quietly. "I never wanted to be Galileo." I gave him a sad nod. "There are worse hills to die on. But make no mistake, you've got 7 to 14 days, tops. After that, the people who matter will come. They'll take everything, and when they're done, you'll be left with nothing. No career, no recognition, not even a whisper of what you found. You won't be heroes. You'll be pariahs, dismissed as frauds. And when the dust settles, your discovery will disappear." Whittle sneered. "More of your conspiracy nonsense, is it? The men in suits? The careers destroyed? You're just bitter. Call it what you want," I said. "I'm past arguing. But trust me on this, none of you will see this work published. Not even in the smallest journals. The moment I saw this, I knew it wasn't a hoax. And that's exactly why you're doomed. Because the people who matter still think you're lying. And when they find out you're not... I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't have to. The flicker of fear in their eyes said they understood. That buys you time, I said. Time to do what? Asked Dr. Greaves. I pointed to the ship, its jagged silhouette an impossible shadow in the ice. To get a closer look, there'll be no credit, no claims, no glory. Only the truth. But for those who value knowledge for its own sake, the truth is enough. It's there, in that ship. I clasped my hands together, unable to contain a gleeful grin. So, who's ready to crack this thing open? Ryan, fiddling with the lighting on his camera, looked up briefly. I didn't have the heart to tell him none of the footage would likely survive outside the camp. Still, his skills with remote camera rigs had proven invaluable. There was something almost comical about watching him explain a GoPro to Professor Shirley, who listened with a mix of irritation and genuine curiosity. In the 4 days since we begun preparations, the cavern was rarely empty. Engineers and mechanics worked tirelessly to drill through the ice, creating a sealed, airtight corridor leading to the ship's hull. Tents sprang up like mushrooms. Quarantine zones were established, and deep-pressure hazmat suits hung like sentinels near the bulkhead. By then, my presence had proven less of an irritant, a favor from an old contact. One capable of delivering a 250,000-pound industrial drill to the middle of nowhere, softened Dr. Whittle's frosty demeanor. Shirley remained distant, but he eventually cracked. One quiet evening, as I smoked outside my tent, he stomped over. "How?" he demanded. "Do you know someone who could pull off a favor like that?" I exhaled, smiling. Proof is in the pudding, Professor. My theories may have gone down in flames, but the truth still holds value in certain circles. Some people will pay anything to know what no one else does. Even more to tag along, or play a role in discovering it. And sooner or later, you will figure that out yourself. He grunted, said nothing, and stomped off again. The crunch of his boots in the snow echoed in the stillness. When the day finally arrived, I watched Shirley and Whittle suit up. They moved with the awkward determination of men aware they were about to step into the unknown. Their hazmat suits, bulky and alien-like, seemed almost comical against the backdrop of the ship. A looming monstrosity of blackened wood, its sheer size both awe-inspiring and menacing. As they waddled toward the bulkhead, a shiver ran through me. This had been my victory, a culmination of favors, resources, and relentless determination. But the sight of the two men dwarfed by that ship filled me with dread. The vessel was a splinter of darkness in the depths, its angular frame too sharp, too deliberate. It looked like it shouldn't have been there, as if it had been ripped from another reality and wedged into ours. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting. My own experiences told me strange things lurked in the Earth's deepest places, things better left undisturbed. The question of who had built this ship and how lingered like a bad taste in the air. I consulted marine architects before arriving. None of them took me seriously. An 800-meter wooden ship? It was laughable, they said. Even modern technology couldn't make such a thing seaworthy. One architect had humored me, speculating that it might work if the wood itself had scaled in proportion, but that, of course, would require trees over 800 meters tall. Gravity, he had said with a dismissive chuckle, doesn't allow trees to grow that big. The memory came back to me as I watched Whittle and Shirley disappear into the bulkhead. The thought should have sparked fascination, but all I felt was unease. The ship loomed like a hungry shadow, its presence far too oppressive to inspire wonder. By the time the doctors reached the hull, hours had passed. A steady stream of samples had been hauled away by eager students, analyzed and cataloged with feverish intensity. Finally, the last section of ice was cut away. The bulkhead hissed, releasing a cold vapor that snaked into the air. Dr. Greaves, now standing beside me, leaned forward, his breath visible in the chilled air. "Here we go," Whittle muttered, barely audible through the crackling radio feed. I watched the live feed from Ryan's cameras as Will took the first step inside. What followed was silence, not just from the radio, but from the entire cavern. The hum of equipment and murmured conversations seemed to dim as every eye locked onto the screens. Whittle's helmet-mounted camera turned slowly, panning over the interior. At first, there was nothing but the blackened hull, its surface unnaturally smooth. But then the beam of his light caught something sharp, angular, and impossibly intricate. It didn't look like wood. It didn't look human. A deep, gut-wrenching hum resonated through the speakers, making everyone in the room flinch. "What was that?" someone whispered, but no one answered. The entrance was barely 2 feet off the ground, a small, ominous gap between the world outside and what lay beyond. One of the men leaned forward into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight pale and chalky in the gloom. The floor was covered in thick layers of dust, white as snow, and the debris beneath it seemed to rise from the ground like forgotten remnants of some long-abandoned place. When one of them climbed upward, the disturbance sent a flurry of ashy flakes sweeping across the screen like a blizzard. The camera's glare caught them briefly, flashing a bright, sterile white before fading again into the inky blackness. The visibility was poor, no walls, no clear sense of direction, just empty space, eerily silent. Hesitantly, Shirley took his first steps, his head whipping around as he tried to gauge the size of the room. It was vast, but the low ceiling pressed down on him like a looming weight. The shadows seemed to pulse, suffocating, like the walls were closing in. We hadn't set up proper medical monitoring, but I could practically hear both of their hearts hammering in their helmets, the frantic sounds of their breathing mingling with the faint mechanical hum of their suits. More than once, they swallowed too loudly, and it made us all feel like intruders in a place that should have been left alone. They moved forward, creeping deeper into the darkness, until something came into view. It flashed past the camera in an instant, before anyone could shout a warning. Shirley had already done a double take and swung the camera back into focus. It was a cage, one of many. Inside, there was little more than a pile of white dust. Beside it, an identical cage stood, similarly filled with what looked like nothing but ash. A few feet behind them, a wall began to emerge from the shadows, and as the men's torches swept across it, we saw more crates, all lined up in a strange, repetitive pattern. Pairs, 2 by 2. I muttered, the words almost slipping from my mouth as I processed the odd arrangement. Dr. Greaves' face had gone pink, confusion washing over him. But it was Ryan's expression that mirrored the confusion and fear of all of us. "What the hell?" Ryan muttered, his voice a low rasp. I turned back to the feed, the sense of dread growing heavier. Shirley and Whittle continued to move, their steps slow and deliberate. They stopped often to collect a few items, resting on top of some of the crates. Most of the objects were knives, sharp, ancient-looking tools. But one caught my eye. It was unlike any knife I'd ever seen before, shaped in a way that reminded me of an Egyptian ritual tool used to remove the brain during mummification. The two men were careful, meticulous, bagging the items one by one and securing them in various pouches on their suits. The process was slow, but it didn't matter. The unease settled deeper. Finally, a break appeared in the wall. A rounded doorway loomed ahead, leading to what lay beyond. Through the gap, we saw wooden steps rising into darkness. Planks of wood were nailed to the walls, but there were no rails. The sight of it sent a cold shiver down my spine. The thought of climbing those stairs made my stomach turn. "Did you see that?" Dr. Whittle's voice cracked through the speakers, suddenly high and frail. Everyone in the room froze. From the back, a nervous laugh echoed, but my eyes never left the screen. He was staring straight up at the stairs, the light from his torch trembling as he tried to see into the shadows. "I saw it," I replied, my voice as cold as the ice surrounding us. "Something moved?" "That's not possible." Dr. Greaves' voice was urgent, grabbing for the speaker. Check the audio recordings, Dr. Shirley said, his tone grim. I didn't see anything, but I'm sure I heard it. Ryan was already working, skimming through the first few minutes of recording. We had 2 standard radios, but the suits were equipped with highly sensitive microphones designed to pick up even the faintest sound. It wasn't until later that I revealed to Ryan the true nature of these devices, specialist gear used by ghost hunters to detect electronic voice phenomena. At the time, the irony had been almost too much to bear, but as the audio feed began to play, it wasn't irony I tasted. It was something much more visceral. A rising peak on the waveform stood out, a jagged spike that made my throat tighten with dread. The playback began, a low, indistinct shuffling, followed by a loud, defining thump, an impact, a heavy sound. Then, a fading drumming noise, like footfalls retreating into the distance, fading until the silence swallowed it whole. For the next few minutes, Whittle refused to look away from the stairs, but Shirley's gaze wandered. He scanned the dark corridor, his eyes fixing on a doorway further down the hall. He couldn't help himself. His curiosity led him forward, his feet moving despite the fear we all shared. As he neared the doorway, I saw it. Inside was another identical room. Cages, more crates, all arranged like pieces of a nightmarish puzzle. Shirley moved closer, drawn to one of the cages. "What's that?" he muttered. The camera struggled to catch the detail. The pile of white dust in the cage. There was something wrong with it, something alive in it. And then it became clear. The dust had a face. A face. The face emerged slowly, as though it had been carved into the mound of dust, primitive, jagged, like the image of a volcanic eruption frozen in time. Too frail. Thin hands clung to the bars of the cage, withered and shriveled, like the limbs of a twisted monkey. The figure's posture was unnatural, and its hollow gaze was enough to freeze the blood. "It looks almost human, doesn't it?" The professor's voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. "It does," I replied, my voice like dry paper, trembling slightly. "Is there anything underneath it, or is it just a pattern left by the dust?" I asked, but Shirley didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt down, pushing his arm through the bars. With cautious, almost reverent movements, he gently poked at the surface. To my surprise, the mound yielded easily to his fingers, sinking in like soft earth. But Shirley must have felt something more, because his voice broke the silence. "It's not all dust," he muttered. His hand emerged from the cage, holding a small piece of skull, brow, eye socket, cheekbone fragile, ancient. He sifted through more dust, pulling out a few long, sharp teeth, too unnatural to belong to any primate. The excitement was palpable in the air as he bagged the pieces, meticulously storing them away. "Wait," Shirley's voice was strained now, suddenly distant. "What's this?" He moved deeper into the darkness, venturing further from the light. Soon, the camera revealed a small stone slab, a makeshift workstation. Large jars were huddled around it, and one, about 2 feet tall, had been pulled to the top and left open. "Be careful," I warned, my voice tight as I realized how far into the blackness Shirley had gone. "Dr. Whittle," I said, turning to the second screen. "Are you okay?" Whittle's eyes were glued to the stairs above him, his breathing shallow and quick. No matter how hard I called, he didn't respond. "Professor," I repeated, urgency creeping into my voice. "I think you need to return to Dr. Whittle." Shirley stood motionless over the open jar, staring down into the featureless, clay-like material inside. It was soft, yielding to the small scraper he used to collect a sample. "Professor," I urged again, "you need to check on." Suddenly, the speaker beside me exploded in a violent cacophony of screams, followed quickly by the professor's own feed shrieking out in terror, both feeds creating a warbling, painful sound. I spun to look at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest, but it was all darkness. The professor fumbled blindly, panicked, and quickly scooped up his feet in the direction Whittle had been. But when he reached the spot, all he found was a lone strip of Whittle's suit. No sign of the man himself. I was shouting, frantically trying to get Ryan to play back the recording from Dr. Whittle's feed. Dr. Greaves grabbed another screen, his face pale, and pressed one side of the headphones to his ear. His expression was sheer terror. "What is it?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest. But Dr. Greaves didn't answer. He looked at me, eyes wide, as if on the brink of collapse. "What can you hear?" I repeated, louder this time. Ryan, standing just behind me, could no longer bear the silence. He reached forward, yanking the headphone jack out of the computer. Both the doctor and I cried out in unison, but it was already too late. The camp was filled with the sounds of wet, labored breathing. Someone hyperventilating, close by. Short, sharp gasps followed by frantic, desperate wheezes that would build into small, wet sobs. "No!" Dr. Whittle's voice trembled through the static, faint but unmistakable. His words repeated in a distant, broken tone. "No! Please, no!" A sharp, terrible crack echoed through the speakers, and some of us winced in horror. The rapid breathing stopped, but in its place, a new sound began, low, gurgling, wet, animal-like panting. I turned the volume off, my hands trembling uncontrollably. My eyes were glued to Professor Shirley's feed. He was close now to the stairs, one foot lifted as though he were preparing to climb. "Professor!" I shouted, but my voice seemed insignificant against the silence that had fallen over the cave. "You need to leave. I have to find him," he roared, his voice filled with raw desperation. "He can't be gone. We can't leave him." His outburst was so loud it hurt the speakers, but it didn't matter. His words faded into an echo of their own as the cave seemed to swallow them. A dreadful silence settled over the camp. Only the sound of dripping water and static hummed in the air. Suddenly, we were all acutely aware of how alone Professor Shirley was. And he, too, realized it. I saw him looking around, his gaze desperate, seeking any sign of life, but all he could find were the oppressive shadows. This was no longer a scientific mission. It was a nightmare carved out of tar, each step further into the dark feeling more disorienting, more dangerous, and far more real than any of us had anticipated. "Leave," I whispered, but this time he didn't argue. The atmosphere thickened with dread, as if the very air had become heavier with each passing moment. I watched Shirley nod, probably more to himself than to me, before turning back to face the entrance. The suit made every movement awkward, yet I willed him to move faster, to escape the dark pull that seemed to tighten around us. In the heavy silence, it felt like every crackle from the radio, every burst of static, carried the weight of something unnatural, like spectral whispers shuffling in the background. I saw the fear begin to eat away at Shirley's resolve. His feed flickered as he moved, the image shaking, and every so often, he flinched at something we couldn't see or hear. He was almost there. "I'm close to the entrance," he said, his voice tight with anticipation. Come on," I whispered, desperate for him to get out. He was no more than 10 or 15 meters from the exit when something shifted in the shadows, something that shouldn't have been there. The professor stopped, frozen like prey before the hunter. My heart hammered in my chest as I saw the thing emerge into the harsh white light. It was tall, hunched under the low ceiling, and its silhouette was blurry, malformed. My blood ran cold. A deep chill washed over me as I watched, the sensation that I was witnessing something from another world creeping over my skin. But I reminded myself, this was real, just 100 meters away from where I stood. The professor's cry rang out, sharp and panicked, and so did ours. The thing reached toward him, its grotesque hand filling the screen. We watched in horror as it moved toward him, and then there was a horrible sound, like a tree cracking and falling, before the screen went black. For a moment, I thought the professor was truly gone. The scream had cut off abruptly, and the radio feed fell silent. I turned to Ryan, but his eyes were red, tears streaking down his face. He didn't speak right away, but I saw him focus on the screen, something catching his attention. The professor's scream hadn't stopped. It was still faint, weak, but it was there. We could still hear it, distant and muffled through the thick airlock doors. He was squealing, desperate. The sounds of pain and terror broke through the static, like a broken radio tuning into another world. I staggered toward the door, my legs barely able to hold me up. My hand hovered above the control panel, trembling as I waited for the screams to finally stop. "Is the air safe?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, quite safe now. We've pumped oxygen into the cavity," Dr. Greaves replied, his voice distant. I leaned against the bulkhead, staring through the window, barely able to make out the tattered remnants of Professor Charlie's suit, still a few feet inside the hole in the ship. My throat tightened as I watched, sickened. How long until the security detail arrives? The doctor asked, his face reflecting the same worry I felt. "Days," I answered, my voice hard. "We push for time. I want what's left of that suit," I said, already knowing his objection. He groaned, disbelief creeping into his voice. "You can't be seriously going through with this." The camp had been quiet since the horror of the previous day. I had forbidden anyone from staying at the secondary site, ordering everyone to hike back to the old one above ground. It wasn't just for safety. It was a necessary risk, a calculated decision to snatch whatever remained of the suit and samples. No one could be around when we did it. For the 1,000th time, I said, my voice low but firm, "I'm deadly serious." Good God! I could sprint there and back in less than 10 seconds. Just keep the lights on the door open and that shotgun pointed firmly at the hole, I added, the edge of frustration slipping into my tone. "This isn't very scientific," he muttered. "And dolphins don't look like mammals," I shot back. "But they absolutely are." I took a breath, forcing myself to steady. Sometimes, science isn't very scientific. I didn't wait for a response. I opened the door and stepped forward, leaving the protective suit behind. The air felt strange, but I tried not to think about it. I pushed the rising panic down and focused on the task ahead. I felt like a child running past a dark closet to reach the bathroom in the middle of the night. Only now, I was running into the darkness. I sprinted down the tunnel, my heart pounding in my throat, my skin crawling with cold dread. Every footfall echoed too loudly in the silence. The entrance was in sight. My legs burned, but I forced myself to move faster, faster. The cold weight in my stomach threatened to drag me down. I reached into the shadow, my hand closing around the cuff of the professor's suit. I yanked it, pulling with all my strength, but something tore, and I was left holding nothing but a small, useless clump of thick fabric. "Damn it!" I cried, my voice strangled with frustration and terror. I whipped my head back toward the door. "Keep that damn door open." I reached my hand further into the darkness, pushing past every instinct telling me to run. My chest pressed to the floor, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to pull away from whatever had settled into the air like a curse. But I couldn't stop now, not without the suit. I could feel the weight of history, the weight of necessity, pulling me forward. When my hand failed to grasp the suit, I acted without thinking. A small, frantic running jump sent me deeper into the dark, my ankles the only thing still outside. I reached into the shadows, and this time, both of my hands locked onto the fabric of Charlie's old suit. As I leaned up, using my elbows to push myself further, I felt the satisfying drag of the heavy equipment against the floor, my heart pounding in sync with every movement. I moved back slowly, inching my way out of the darkness, my feet brushing the floor beneath me. But then, my eyes locked onto something in the gloom, something that shouldn't have been there. A large white oval floated in the dark, almost like a distorted bowling ball. But the holes, two of them blinked. It was a face, a pale, unsettling face, as large as my torso. There was no emotion, no intent, just a cold, implacable stillness. It was impossible to gauge what it was thinking, if it was thinking at all. Was it curious? Fearful? Hateful? The uncertainty made it all the more terrifying. I couldn't look away, even though my chest tightened and tears welled up in my eyes. I moved as slowly as the earth itself, inching back, never breaking the gaze. I had to keep moving, though, even as the terror pressed down on me, heavier than the darkness around us. Finally, about halfway to the exit, I snapped into action, throwing the suit over my shoulder and sprinting for the light. The doctor looked confused at first, but then his eyes shifted over my shoulder. I knew what he was seeing. I passed him in a blur, my feet barely touching the ground, a mad burst of energy carrying me forward. I threw myself onto the floor and screamed, "Shut the door! Shut the damn door!" It wasn't until the door finally clunked shut behind me, its handle turning with a finality that made my stomach churn, that I let myself breathe again. But I couldn't relax yet. I could feel the eyes on me, even as the doctor remained fixated on something over my shoulder. When I stood and moved toward the window, I saw it again, that same alien face, pale, blank, and hauntingly still, staring at us through the hole in the hull of the ship. It hadn't moved at all for what felt like an eternity, locked in an eerie gaze with us. And then, when it did finally move, it tilted its head, a slow, deliberate turn, as if it were trying to understand what we were, or perhaps what we were doing. It lingered for a moment, as if considering us, before it sank back into the darkness of the ship, disappearing as silently as it had arrived. The quiet was oppressive, like something had shifted in the air. The biologist, holding a small sample of clay, broke the silence. "It's fungal," she said, her voice trembling. "It's unlike anything I've ever seen, except in ancient fossils. And even then, nothing quite like this." Dr. Greaves, his expression unreadable, nodded slowly. "Perhaps, but what exactly are we dealing with here?" "I wouldn't eat it," the biologist continued, shaking her head. "It's going nuts under the petri dish. It may look inert, but whatever's going on under the surface, it's doing it at an astonishing rate. In the time we've had it, it's undergone tens of thousands of generations. The dust, the skull sample, they're similar but different." I leaned in. My curiosity piqued despite the dread still swirling in my gut. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I don't know," she said, her voice unsure. "Some of the samples share similar features, but some of them are corrupted by the fungus, just like the sample from the vase. But it's inert, at least for now. The skull, its marrow is fungal in origin, but there are blood vessels that look distinctly mammalian. The cranial structure is definitely primate." I stepped closer, looking down at the sample. Dr. Greaves and the biologist both warned me to be careful, but I waved them off. With a quick motion, I took a small piece of it onto my finger. I crushed it between my fingers and then rolled it back into a ball, examining it further. I even took a moment to smell it. "It's clay," I said, a strange certainty filling me. Or rather, it's something anyone without a microscope would call clay. The doctor furrowed his brow. "What does that mean?" "The delusion is the oldest myth in the world," I replied. "Noah's Ark. It's part of nearly every recorded civilization. Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Babylonian, even Hindu, Greek, and Welsh. Creation myths. They're all connected in some way." The weight of my words hung in the air, the room feeling colder. The presence of something ancient and far older than us, pressing down on us. The first chemical ignited. The white tendrils recoiled, momentarily hesitating, before shriveling back into the center of the table like a creature burned by sunlight. The fire spread rapidly, and the white mass crackled in the heat, sending an acrid smoke up into the air. The biologist shouted something, but I couldn't hear her over the roaring flames. I kept my hand steady as I threw the rest of the chemicals onto the writhing mass, the flames growing hotter with each splash. The lab filled with the stench of burning flesh, a mixture of plastic, and something indescribable that made my stomach churn. It wasn't just the intensity of the flames. It was what the fire was consuming. Something far more ancient and insidious than anything we'd ever encountered. When the last of the mass collapsed into a charred, smoking heap, the room fell into a strange, unsettling silence. The flickering remnants of the fire cast long shadows across the room, and we all stood there, staring at the aftermath in disbelief. I could feel my heart pounding, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The lump of clay, the thing that had squirmed on my finger like it was alive, was now nothing but ashes. But what had it been? What had we just seen? That wasn't just clay, Dr. Greaves muttered, his voice low and trembling. That was something else. Something far older. Something far more dangerous. The biologist, still shaken, nodded but said nothing. She stood there, her hands shaking as she wiped sweat from her brow, her eyes fixed on the remains of the creature. I looked around the room, my mind racing. The images of that thing, the face, the floating city, the alien presence, came flooding back. It all felt like it was connected, like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't ready to solve. What the hell did we just unleash? The biologist whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. The fear that had settled in my chest earlier now seemed like a pale shadow compared to the terror that surged through me now. We hadn't just stumbled upon an ancient civilization or an apocalyptic myth. We had uncovered something that had been hidden for millennia, something waiting for the right moment to awaken. And we had no idea what would happen next. We moved forward cautiously, the dim light of our flashlights flickering across the walls. The further we ventured into the ship, the more the atmosphere seemed to thicken with a strange, oppressive weight. It wasn't just the physical air, it felt as if the place itself was alive, watching us, reacting to our presence. The tracks we followed led us through a series of narrow hallways, some lined with strange, unidentifiable symbols carved into the walls, others marked by more human-like footprints that seemed to shift in size, as if the creature or creatures could change their form at will. The deeper we went, the more distorted the world around us became. Shapes flickered in the corner of our eyes, whispers echoed through the hallways, and the smell of rot and decay mixed with something else, something sweet, almost like incense. The biologist seemed on edge, her eyes darting around, scanning the walls for anything that might offer an explanation. But the more we uncovered, the less certain she seemed. Dr. Greaves, too, was quiet, lost in thought, as though the weight of the ship's secrets was beginning to dawn on him. "Do you hear that?" I asked suddenly, my voice barely above a whisper. The sound had been faint at first, but now it was growing louder, like a low hum, almost imperceptible, vibrating through the walls. "I don't hear anything," the man beside me muttered, but he kept his hand on his shotgun, his finger hovering near the trigger. I ignored him and pressed forward, following the sound. It wasn't until we rounded the next corner that I saw it. A massive door, partially open, with a faint glow leaking from the crack. The sound was coming from inside. We moved cautiously toward it, and as we did, I felt my heart race. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and we stepped into a large chamber. The air inside felt colder, heavier. There, in the center of the room, was an enormous structure. A workshop, just as I'd hoped. It was filled with strange artifacts, twisted sculptures, and bizarre contraptions that seemed to defy the laws of physics. But it was a centerpiece that caught my eye. The large, vaguely humanoid figure, sculpted from the same clay-like substance that had nearly destroyed us. It was incomplete, its form still in the process of being shaped, and yet it exuded a sense of power, of purpose. I could feel its presence, even as I stared at it. This is what we've been looking for," I whispered, my voice trembling with awe. The others gathered around, examining the room, but they, too, were drawn to the figure. It was unlike anything any of us had ever seen. Its form was humanoid, yes, but it was wrong. Its proportions were distorted, and its skin, if you could call it skin, was a pale, almost translucent hue, pulsating faintly as though it were breathing. It was a work of art, But it was also something far more sinister. I stepped closer to it, my eyes narrowing as I studied its features. I could feel the ship's energy, a strange, almost hypnotic pull that made it difficult to focus. It was as if the figure was calling to me, urging me to come closer, to finish it. I resisted the urge, but the temptation was overwhelming. "What is this?" The biologist's voice was barely audible, and when I turned to look at her, I saw that her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. What kind of creature was this meant to be? "I don't know," I said, my voice hoarse. "But whatever it is, it's connected to everything. The ship, the clay, the flood. It's all part of the same story." The room felt colder still, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through my bones. Something in the air shifted. The door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. And then, just as I feared, the figure moved. It was slow at first, like a marionette being manipulated by invisible strings. But then it started to rise, its limbs twisting unnaturally, cracking as if they hadn't been used in millennia. It turned its head toward us, its empty eyes locking onto mine. And then, just as quickly, the figure collapsed back into its unfinished form, its clay-like body crumbling into dust. The air around us grew still again, the hum fading away. The ship was alive, and it was waiting. I felt the weight of it then, the knowledge that we had awoken something that shouldn't have been disturbed, something far older and more powerful than any of us had ever anticipated, and we were trapped in its world now. I could only hope we would survive long enough to understand what it wanted. The air was thick with dust, and the strange, unsettling atmosphere of the ship weighed heavily on me. I could hear the faint scuffle of footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. The darkness ahead felt more like a threat than a simple absence of light. There was something lurking in that void, something that had been here long before us, something that knew this place better than any of us ever would. As I moved forward, my hand brushed against the cold, smooth surface of the walls, feeling the ancient grooves carved deep into the material. The scratches, the gouges, these weren't just signs of wear and age. They were deliberate, purposeful. Someone or something had marked this place. The air seemed to hum with the memory of whatever had transpired here. We passed more rooms, each more bizarre than the last. Some had been abandoned, left as if the occupants had simply vanished. Others were filled with disturbing, twisted signs of life. In one room, the walls were covered in faintly glowing symbols, too perfect to be carved by human hands, yet too chaotic to be anything but a language. They seemed to pulse, and for a moment, I could have sworn the symbols shifted under my gaze. My heart raced as we approached a particularly narrow hallway that stretched off into total darkness. The sound of our footsteps echoed ominously, each step magnified in the silence. The glow of our flashlights barely penetrated the gloom, and the deeper we went, the more the shadows seemed to move with us, as if the ship itself was alive and watching. One of the men muttered something under his breath, something about the whispers that had started to grow louder, but I couldn't tell if it was fear or something else creeping into his voice. The longer we stayed in this place, the more I felt it too, the tension, the fear, the feeling that something was just waiting for us to let our guard down. I moved to the next door, a heavy, rusted thing that seemed like it had been sealed shut for centuries. It creaked ominously as I pushed it open, revealing a darkened room. Inside, the floor was littered with bones, human, animal, and something else, something unrecognizable. The air in the room was suffocating, and I could almost hear the faint, whispered voices of the past, like an echo of whatever horror had taken place here. "Is this it?" one of the men asked, his voice trembling with something that wasn't just fear. His hand was still tied around the shotgun, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I didn't answer him immediately. My eyes were locked on something at the far end of the room, a shape barely visible in the shadows, but undeniably there. It was tall, humanoid, yet wrong in a way that made every instinct in me scream to run. It stood perfectly still, watching us, or so I thought. I couldn't be sure. The darkness made everything appear distorted. "Move," I whispered, my voice low and urgent. "Get out of here now." But the men were frozen, caught in the same web of fear that I felt creeping up on me. As one, they turned toward the figure, unable to tear their eyes away, as if something, an invisible force, was holding them in place. Then the figure moved, slowly, unnaturally, its joints clicking like brittle wood. It tilted its head, and I heard a sound, almost like a hiss, low and drawn out, the kind of noise that rattles your bones. "Run!" I shouted, shoving one of the men forward. In that instant, chaos erupted. The men scattered, but their movements were clumsy, disoriented by fear. I barely managed to keep my footing as we scrambled back through the dark, the sound of something large and heavy following us. It wasn't until we reached the safety of the stairwell that I dared look back, but the figure had vanished, into the shadows, into the depths of the ship. It was the beginning of something. I could feel it. The ship wasn't just a relic. It was a living memory, and the creature we'd seen, it was the keeper of that memory. It knew what had happened here, what had been created here, and it wanted us to know. But I wasn't sure I wanted to learn the truth anymore. But none of them had the sense of purpose or intelligence like the creature we'd seen earlier. Whatever those things were, rats, mantis, or any of the other horrors we'd encountered, they were all part of a system of survival, feeding, growing, and dying, but nothing like the alien intelligence that the ship itself seemed to hint at. As I walked, a cold shiver ran up my spine. We hadn't even scratched the surface of what this place could hold. But I had the nagging sense that if we were ever going to get to the core of it, we might not make it back. We reached the stairwell, and I paused before descending. The weight of the silence that surrounded us was almost palpable, as though the ship itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone. I shook my head, trying to push aside the creeping feeling that something was following us, waiting in the shadows. One of the men, still carrying his shotgun, glanced nervously around. "You think this place is alive?" he muttered, as if testing the air with his words. I didn't answer right away. There was no point in denying what was obvious. The ship was a living thing, maybe not in the traditional sense, but it was conscious in its own way. Its designs, the creatures within it, the patterns they followed, all of it spoke to a mind, an ancient intelligence that we still couldn't fully comprehend. Instead, I just nodded grimly, and we began our descent. The further down we went, the more I could feel that sense of being watched. I wanted to believe it was just a paranoia creeping in, but something told me that this ship had been waiting for us for a long, long time. As we neared the bottom, the air seemed heavier, thick with dust and something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. We stopped at the next landing, checking for signs of danger. A flicker of movement caught my eye, and I froze, instinctively reaching for my weapon. But when I looked again, nothing was there. "Did you see that?" one of the men asked, his voice shaking. "I saw something," I said quietly. "But we're not alone. Not here. Not anywhere." We continued down, each step heavier than the last. The further we went, the more unsettling it became. At first, the creature sightings were odd, unsettling even. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not meant to be here. Something had noticed us, and it was waiting for us to slip up. I pushed forward, my breathing shallow as I crawled through the suffocating darkness. I had no plan, no rational thought, only the instinct to escape, to get to something, anything, that could make sense of the nightmare unraveling around us. The shots behind me echoed, fading away into desperate silence. The ship's endless corridors twisted like a labyrinth, each turn more disorienting than the last. I couldn't hear the others anymore, only my own frantic pulse thundering in my ears. I had to keep moving. Suddenly, there was a faint light ahead, barely noticeable at first. I froze, straining my senses. The air felt different here, cooler. The eerie stillness was replaced by a soft hum, almost mechanical. A glow radiated from beneath a door, the faintest crack of light seeping through the edges. I reached it, my heart pounding in my throat, and pushed the door open. What I saw took the breath right out of my chest. The room beyond was massive, cavernous even, but what stood out were the walls, alive. They weren't made of stone or metal, but of something far stranger. Pale, shifting masses, like the ship itself was breathing, pulsing with energy. At the far end, illuminated in that strange green glow, was a massive, round object, the source of the light. It resembled an egg, but one that was far too large to ever belong to anything we knew. I stepped forward cautiously, my every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had come too far. This was what we were looking for, the heart of the ship. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the chamber, and I turned to see something emerge from the shadows. A figure, humanoid but not human, moving with unnatural fluidity. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that reached out toward me. Its face was a grotesque, shifting mask, a blend of features that made my stomach turn, like an abstract portrait of every nightmare I'd ever had. For a moment, I thought I might collapse from the terror, but I couldn't. Not now. I had to know what this thing was, why it was here, why we had been drawn to it. It took a step closer, and I didn't move. I didn't speak. I was paralyzed, my breath caught in my chest. And then in the silence, I heard something in my mind, a voice. You shouldn't have come here. I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. What was this place? What was this thing? Before I could answer myself, the creature's form flickered, like a television going static. The air around it rippled with unnatural energy, and for a moment, I wondered if I was losing my mind. The voice again, this time clearer, more urgent. You don't belong here, but you will help me. I backed away instinctively, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. I was stuck, trapped in the pull of whatever force this place had over me. The creature reached out, its hand impossibly long, fingers curling like claws toward me, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from its strange, hollow gaze. For a moment, time itself seemed to stretch, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. And then I heard it, a loud crash behind me. The door to the chamber slammed shut with a deafening bang, and in that instant, everything went dark. That the monster behind me might be confined to one of them, but the hope was fleeting. The cages were too small for something of that size. I could hear the screeching of metal as the creature squeezed through narrow passageways, relentless and growing closer. I reached another doorway, my breath ragged, but it was a dead end. I cursed under my breath, turned to face the only option left. The dim glow of the torches I had stolen from the others flickered in the oppressive silence, casting long shadows across the cold, sterile floor. The room was larger, filled with tools, broken sculptures, and strange mechanical devices. It looked like some kind of workshop, but not one made for humans. I had no idea who or what had crafted such pieces, nor why this place seemed to keep getting stranger with each step. I could hear the creature's growls now, low and guttural, vibrating through the walls. Its pursuit was relentless, and I had no choice but to press forward. I darted past the nearest workbench, pushing aside piles of half-formed sculptures. I didn't care if I made noise anymore. The creature was almost on top of me. My feet slammed against the cold, unforgiving floor as I made my way deeper into the structure. The air here was thick, heavy, like the walls themselves were alive with the energy of forgotten things. I turned the corner, hoping for an exit, but instead, I was met by an expansive chamber that seemed to stretch out forever. The walls were lined with more cages, this time far larger, as if they had been designed to contain something much bigger, something far more dangerous than anything I'd seen so far. And then I saw it, at the far end of the chamber. A massive figure emerged from the shadows, its body blotting out the light. It was hunched almost skeletal, Its skin stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes, if you could call them eyes, glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening thud. I had no way out. I was cornered. I raised my gun, heart pounding in my chest, knowing it wouldn't be enough. The creature was too close, too fast, and its hunger too great. It stepped forward, its enormous claws scraping against the stone floor, sending a sickening sound through the air. I had only seconds. What could I do? I could barely think through the panic, but in that moment, a realization struck me. It wasn't the creatures we had to fear. It was the ship itself. The ship wasn't just alive. It was evolving, changing, adapting, and the creatures that had followed us, that had attacked us, were part of that evolution. They were its offspring, its defense mechanism, and they weren't here to hunt us. They were here to protect the ship. I had been right all along. The truth was far worse than I could have imagined. I dropped to the floor, not sure if I was giving up or just bracing for what was to come. I knew somehow that I would never leave this place. Not alive, not whole. And yet, I couldn't stop myself from whispering the same words I had whispered for the last few hours. I'm so close. And with that, the darkness swallowed me whole. Watching the creature work, its movements almost hypnotic. Each delicate press of its hands into the dust seemed intentional. The slow, meticulous way it formed the clay revealing a quiet determination. There was no rush, no need to hurry. I had no fear of it anymore. Or perhaps the fear had simply been replaced by something else, a kind of reverence. The thing was ancient, its body falling apart piece by piece. Yet it continued to rebuild itself with the same care it put into its creations. It had spent countless years, perhaps eons, crafting life forms from this dust, yet here it was still trying to piece itself together. I couldn't help but feel a strange kinship with it, the way it desperately clung to its purpose, even as its body decayed and its time ran out. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching it fashion the clay into something that began to take form, an almost lifelike shape, delicate wings, an elegant body, a bird, just like the ones in the artist's workshop. It was as though the creature was recreating the same works that had been smashed in its rage all those years ago. It seemed to be attempting to right its wrongs, to fix the broken pieces of its existence. But the more it worked, the more I could see the limits of its efforts. The bird's form was incomplete, as if some part of it was forever missing. The wings, though delicate and feathered, lacked the natural fluidity that the artist had once given them. The creature's movements were precise, yet the clay didn't respond as it once had, refusing to mold perfectly. The bird would never fly. I couldn't help but wonder, had it ever been meant to fly? Or had the artist's curse forever doomed the creatures to live out their days trapped in this place, never to escape the cycle of creation and destruction? Was this creature simply another broken creation, a relic of an unfulfilled purpose? Just as I was, the creature didn't seem to care. It continued its work with a quiet determination, oblivious to the cracks in its form and the futility of its existence. I felt a pang of sympathy, but also a deep sense of foreboding. I couldn't stay. Something about the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The stillness, which had been so comforting moments ago, now felt suffocating. There was a heavy weight in the air, as if the ship itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I realized suddenly that I had been standing in the presence of something far older and far more dangerous than I had ever anticipated. The creature's work was endless, a cycle it could never break free from, just as I had become trapped in my own pursuit of answers. I took one last look at the bird, at the creature, and silently turned away, heading back into the labyrinth of the ship. I didn't know where I was going anymore. The only thing I was sure of was that the truth had never been as clear as it was in that moment. The weight of the truth hit me all at once, sinking into my bones. The paramedic's offhand comment, something so innocuous at first, suddenly felt like a death sentence. I looked at the dust that had settled on my jacket, that same white clay, and the room around me seemed to close in, the air thick with a feeling of impending doom. I thought I understood everything. The creature, the endless creations, the god forged from desperation, the fungal parasite, the smuggling of memories, it all made sense. But now, seeing that clay dust, I realized that the truth was far more insidious than I could have ever imagined. The samples they had taken were just the beginning. The parasite, the thing that absorbed memories, the thing that twisted reality into new forms, had already been spread. It wasn't just confined to that ship or even to the research. No, it was within me. I had become part of the same cycle, part of the endless creation and destruction. The god had made me, just as it had made all those before me. I had been a creation of its own. As the paramedics continued to work, I could feel a strange tingling under my skin. It wasn't just the dust on my jacket. It was inside me, slowly taking root, twisting and changing something deep within my very essence. I thought back to the figure, the godlike creature, and how it had watched me with those empty eyes, shaping clay as if it were shaping life itself. I looked down at my hands, wondering if the transformation had already begun. Could it be that I was already becoming one of them? Was this my fate? To be absorbed by the very thing I had sought to understand? The idea that I was no longer truly human, that I had become part of the endless cycle of creation, filled me with horror. The world outside might be moving forward, hiding the truth, but in that moment, I realized there was no escape. The truth had already seeped into everything, and now it had seeped into me. I was part of it, just as much a creation as those sculptures, as the god itself. I was a piece of the puzzle, and the puzzle was far from complete. The paramedic's voice cut through my thoughts, his words distant and blurry as I began to feel a coldness spreading from deep within me. "You're going to be okay," he said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. But I knew better. I wasn't going to be okay. The truth was that the ship, the god, the parasite, had already claimed me. I was its latest creation, and now there was no turning back.